Hey everybody, I am here with the X32 and I'm just going to be talking through today my typical X32 setup for church, for a worship service. This is not necessarily the best way. This is not, you should copy this and do everything I'm doing, but this is how I like to do it. And so if you just bought an X32 or maybe you're looking to refresh your board with a new layout, maybe you've been just kind of adding things on as you needed it and it's become sort of messy, this might help you, lay it out in a way that makes a little more sense. So to start with, I typically go with like a festival style patch, and I'm sure that there are lots of professional sound guys out there who would tell me that I'm not doing it right, but this is just the way that works for me. So I start out over here with drums. So in our case, I have kick, snare, hat, floor tom. Usually there's a rack tom in here, but for the sake of the last service we were at, there was no rack tom. And then 2 overheads. So those first 6 channels are drums. And like I said, if there's a rack tom, if you have another, like 2 floor toms, you can throw those in there. But drums go first, and then MD mic for our drummer. This is just good if you ever have like a panic situation where the drummer needs to talk to everybody, especially if the drummer is firing Ableton. So I've put the drummer MD mic here. It is white because in my color coding, you're welcome to color yours however you want, but with mine, white stuff doesn't typically go through the mains. So green is most instruments. White is for stuff that really only I need to see. So in this case, our MD mic for our drummer and our MD mic for our actual MD. So those two are side by side there. That's also typically easy because I find that in the case of whenever we're doing these mobile trips, so we'll go and do like a weekend camp or something like that, both those MD mics are going to a sub snake near the drums because the actual snake might be on the other side of the stage. So I've got like an 8 or a 12 channel sub snake that I'll throw over there on the drum kit. And that way I can have the drummer's MD mic, and then the regular MD mic is typically not far away on stage. So I'll plug him into that sub snake as well. Next up, because the drummer or the regular MD is typically firing Ableton, I've got our 4 tracks channels. So we run ours through a Scarlett. You might have a Scarlett, you might have a Motu, you might just run it through 2 DIs, whatever works for you. So in our case, click and guide comes down the first one, and then we got 3 separate tracks channels. Sometimes I'll label those with what they actually are. So, maybe it'll say like synths and bass and percussion, but we change it up all the time. So I just leave them unlabeled, and we'll change them at the time of the show. After that, we keep rolling with the rhythm section. We've got bass here and then keys. This is the only thing that doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of a logical layout. I have 2 crowd mics left and right that I'll put here on 15 and 16. And they are only here in this order because whenever I first started using crowd mics, channels 15 and 16 were the only ones open. But I've decided to leave them here because once we get to the second page here, I have electric guitars, acoustic guitars, and vocals. And I find that electrics and acoustics are typically what are competing in a mix with vocals. So I like having my vocals and all of my guitars on the same page. So I've decided to leave both these crowd mics over here so that I can have all the guitars and the vocals together. So yeah, next up, 17 and 18 is electric guitars, E guitar left, E guitar right, and then acoustic guitar. I'm even intentional in the naming. I write A guitar, not acoustic, so that I can see the name of the guitar player. You may also notice I'm not using these little the icons that the X32 has for channels, where you can do you can put like the little picture of a guitar or whatever. I don't like to do that just because I don't like the way the icons look. If you like them, more power to you. Be free. But we've got our 2 electrics, 2 acoustics. Like I said, if you've got 3 acoustics or if you've only got 1, it's whatever. And then red is for vocals for me, which in this case we have 3 vocals. I have 1 unused channel here for 24. That would be a 4th vocal if we wanted another BGV, or if we throw in something that's typically not in the band. So something, in our case, something like a violin or a mandolin, if we're doing a special song that calls for it, I'll throw it in that last slot. For these, this is my camp setup. So 1 through 24 is coming through the stage rack. We just have an S32 digital snake on stage. 25 through 32 is local inputs on the board. So this is all stuff that lives at front of house. MD booth is my mic. And yes, I know that there is a place to plug in a TalkBack mic, but I find that the musicians who have custom molded in-ears, my TalkBack mic is way too loud for them when it is the appropriate volume for people who are using not custom mold in-ears. So I like having the control of being able to send my microphone at different levels to different in-ear mixes. Like I said, if you want to run it through the regular TalkBack, that's totally fine. I just like the flexibility because with that TalkBack mic, your talk level is the same for everybody. So it's either too quiet for the people that are using cheap in-ears, or it's way too loud for the people using custom molds. So 25 I typically leave empty just because I like having everything right aligned here, as odd as that sounds. That'll just be if I ever need to plug in something extra at front of house. 26, my MD mic. 27 and 28 is our media computer channels. So it's labeled video L and R, but that's also where, our background music and all that other stuff, any videos that play during a message, it's all coming out of that channel. Then 29 and 30 are handheld 1, handheld 2. That is our 2 wireless mics. We typically leave 2 wireless mics on side stage for like MCs or any person that might need a microphone, or if we do something where we're talking to the crowd and walking around with a microphone in the crowd, that's what those 2 are for. And then Lav 1, Lav 2, it should say headset 1, headset 2, but Lav is shorter, and I like being able to see this WS. This WS stands for white stripe. So I've got here one of our packs has a white stripe on it, and our handhelds are the same way. And I do this, it's not quite as helpful with those packs because typically people have those in their back pocket, but with the handhelds specifically, in our case, we only have 2 of them. I'll put just a little ring of white tape underneath the top of the handheld. That way, when somebody grabs it and they're on stage, I can see which microphone they have without having to sort of like ride both levels and see which one are they talking in handheld 1, handheld 2. And if you have more than one wireless handheld, you could obviously do multiple colors. You could do a red stripe, you could do a green stripe, you could do a purple stripe, whatever you wanted to do. But that's just something that is helpful when front of house is at a distance and you need to be able to see what microphone is being held by which person. So that's the channel breakdown. And with auxes, I'll occasionally, video L and R are on aux 1 and 2. I don't have it plugged into a DI. If I have a spare DI, I like going through a DI with my media computer because it's a little cleaner. But, for the sake of this most recent camp, it was being fed, you can see there, by aux 1 and aux 2. Aux 3 and 4 is for a separate aux line. I have it labeled iPod, but that could be your phone or an iPad that's playing music or whatever. I find sometimes we need to fade multiple music sources in, or it's helpful for me to be able to control the background music without having to yell at my slide operator to turn the music on or cut the sound effect off or whatever. So it's nice to have 2 aux lines. I'm typically not running a third. That USB line is just for playback from your actual USB recorder. And then these are the returns for effects sends. So that is everything on this side of the board. Let's start talking about over here on my right bank. I have DCAs for drums, bass, and keys. And you may be wondering, why do a DCA for bass and keys? Because it's only one channel. We're not typically running more than one bass player or more than one keys player. That is because, I mentioned earlier, I like having all of my acoustics and electrics and vocals on one page. But if I need to reach over here and pull keys up really quickly for a quiet part or turn them down, same thing for bass or drums, I can effectively mix everything looking at this one page once I have my drum mix set. So same thing with tracks over here. I don't know if you can read that because it's the dark blue, but that is all of my track sends. And so I can effectively do a full mix here with DCAs, and that way I don't have to be flipping pages back and forth. I can stay on top of the vocal, especially if it's like a bridge with an instrumental intro where there's no talking or singing for 20 seconds. You just want to be able to have a little more flexibility there. So drums, bass, keys, electric guitars, tracks, effects. This is one I started doing this years ago because I find it's easier than jumping over to the returns page or to the sends page. I like having specifically my vocal effects. I don't tend to do it as much with like drum effects or band verb or anything like that. This is just for vocal effects. And that way I have quick access to it and, can turn it down if they're talking or can turn it up if they start singing and I wasn't paying attention or if they started singing sooner than I expected. And that is just, if I hold it here, you can see it is just the returns and the sends for vocal effects. And then the last two are band and vocals verbs. So I've got all of the instruments, including tracks, on one DCA. You can see there. And then there, it's all those that are lit up. Obviously, the MD mics and the click and the crowd mic are not in there. But I put all of band on one. And I put all of vocals on this other one. And that one is for, like in the middle of a song, if a worship leader starts talking during that 30-second interlude, going into a bridge or whatever, I can just quickly pull the band down so they're not quite as loud. We can hear the worship leader who's talking loud and clear. And then whenever the worship leader is done talking, we can just fade them back up. That's also helpful for if your band plays their last song and then a pastor or an MC or whoever comes up to do the closing, we can just pull vocals down and pull the band down a little bit so that they can still underscore as the pastor is leaving. And then if they want to play out of the service, we can just fade them back up. So I like having the flexibility of those two DCAs. I use these three at the end, effects, band, and vocals. Those are the ones that my hands are on the most. So let's talk about effects real quick. So the way I have mine set up is vocal verb, Vox for short, vocal verb, vocal delay, drum verb, and band verb. So vocal verb and vocal reverb and vocal delay are exactly what they sound like. Drum verb I typically only use on snare and floor tom. I might put a little bit of hi-hat in there, just for fun. And I can see that I've got some kick in there, but that's kind of a negligible amount of verb for the kick drum. I find if you send too much kick drum, and even sometimes too much of your floor tom, if it's really, really low, it can get muddy and kind of indiscernible. So I typically am only using this for snare. I'll add a little bit of hat in there because I personally think it sounds nice. Some people won't put any cymbals in their drum verb, and that's okay. You do whatever you think sounds best. And then I'll put some tom in there as well. And if I had a rack tom in this particular show, I'd be sending rack tom to it as well. And that just helps those toms sound a little more full. I personally like my toms to sound like kick drums and my kick drums to sound like cannons. So this sort of helps with that. And then the last one is labeled band verb. That I'll put a little bit of keys in there. Again, I've got a negligible amount of bass being sent to it. I could honestly probably pull that out if I wanted to. But that is typically for acoustic guitars. That helps make those acoustics feel bigger, especially if you have somebody playing something with playing something like a Taylor GS Mini, where they have passive pickups in them and they sound a little bit thin. You can help thicken that up with a little bit of band verb. And you also, you'll need to EQ the returns here. So like my vocal, that's the vocal verb EQ. vocal delay EQ, just to prevent it from getting muddy. Drum verb EQ is like this. I typically, that changes based on the drum. The floor tom that we have rings really, really bad, right under 200. That's why that's there. And then band verb, I usually just do a low pass, a high pass. I'll sometimes roll some off the top end as well, but for the sake of the guitars we had, it sounded great with just that high pass filter floating right around 153. The only other thing is, you can see here, buses 9 through 12 are bus feeds for worship and speaking. What I find when running a camera line that's recording audio from the board, or even just with this USB recorder, is that worship will be super loud and the speaking will be super quiet if you just mix as you naturally would. So I set up these worship and speaking bus mixes. So speaking just has these 4 wireless mics and maybe this video feed as well. I can't really remember. But speaking has that. Worship has everything else. And typically, these are actually reversed. They would be like this, where worship is pulled down, speaking is a little bit higher, and that helps sort of normalize, level out those volumes for those on the recording. That way your worship isn't that much louder than your speaking. And typically it's more about the speaking being quieter. That's the problem I've found with, I don't know if this is all soundboards or just the X32, but it seems like the speaking volume of just a regular microphone is really, really quiet whenever it's recorded. So I've got that and might even boost it up 5 decibels, and then I'll pull this down -7, -10. I think that is pretty much it as far as how my board is laid out. If, for those of you who are curious, again, you don't necessarily want to copy and paste, but talking through my effects for vocal verb, right now I have a plate verb. I actually typically go with Vintage Room. I was trying some new stuff out with my vocal effects on this past trip. So right now, vocal verb is set as a plate verb, stereo delay for vocal delay, plate verb again for drum verb, and then Vintage Room is the one I like to use for band verb on those acoustic guitars. Then over here in slots 5 and 6, I'll keep de-essers for our vocalists. I didn't need them this time, so you can see that they're not, only one channel has it routed and it's not even inserted yet. And then these last 2 are EQs. This number 7 effect slot, that is the EQ for our subs. Number 8 is the EQ for the mains. So that is, I don't take like a separate graphic EQ and insert it. I just use the built-in effects here to do my tuning for our systems. And so, it's just a little cut here around the 600 or so mark so that it doesn't sound boxy with our particular mains. And then those subs, this is really dependent on the room. We have an environment here that here on site at our church that if you turn up 60 or 80, the ceiling just rattles uncontrollably loud. And so I'll pull that down if we're in-house, whereas on the trip we were on, I actually boosted a lot of these lower, below 60 just to really get the bone rattling frequencies in there, and then had to cut a little bit with 63 and 80, and then I'll roll it off from there for subs. And I think that about does it. I guess the only other thing, if we're really getting into the nitty-gritty here, is these encoder buttons. I have I don't know if you can see it here. I have the XLive card where you can record multitrack to SD cards. And so I have these buttons set up. These 4 are controlling that recorder. So if I hit the top left, it brings up the setup page for the recorder. The bottom left of this quadrant, or this half, is for adding a marker in your playback. And that way you can quickly skip to a certain part. And then I've got record and stop for those. The only other button of these I use is this, which is the tap delay for vocal delay. So that's your tap tempo. And then I think these two are, or just the first one. The bottom one is set for taking me to the vocal effect controls. Before I had that SD recorder, I just had it set where 1, 2, 3, 4, or I guess 9, 10, 11, 12 took me to the effect controls for 1, 2, 3, 4. And then these rotary knobs just set the amount of delay in seconds that we have on our vocal effects and our tom verb, stuff like that, or drum verb altogether. But now that I've got that recorder, that is mainly just my recording controls and tap tempo. That's the only thing I'm using on that side of the board. I personally don't like to use mute groups. You are more than welcome to, but I find that I've got plenty of control just with my actual DCAs. And, I guess this is one other thing here. Let's talk about matrices for just a second. If you're not familiar, a matrix send is just a duplicate of your audio feed, and you can send that wherever. So in our case, we sometimes will live stream events. So this matrix is being fed by those two buses, and that lets me control the volume. That way, when it goes to live stream, it is all one consistent level. You know, you may have, if you're setting this up in your church, you might have one that says live stream, one for the nursery, one for the lobby, one for outdoors, and you can just send your audio wherever you want it to and, adjust the volume. Maybe it needs to be louder in the nursery, but or louder, let's say louder outdoors, but not quite so loud in the nursery. And then in your lobby, you really want it low so that people can hear each other talking. And you can have up to 6 here. And I'm only using the 1, so that's all we need. But you might need upwards of 6 or only 3 or whatever, whatever works for you. Just set it up in the way that fits your church's needs. I think that's about it. If you've got any questions, I guess just post them in the comments below. Like I said, there are probably professional sound guys watching this saying, no, you're doing that all wrong. But this is the setup that works for me, and you've got to find the setup that works for you. So if you see stuff you liked, grab it, use it, feel free. And if you saw stuff that you thought was dumb, you hated for whatever reason, then just ignore that part. Hopefully this is just helpful for you if you are setting this up for the first time, or if your setup has become messy just because you've grown and changed and your band is bigger than it used to be, and now you need like a more logical layout for your board. Hopefully this is helpful for you.